Welcome to Conservation Conversation with me, Kaz. In this episode of our podcast, we welcome back Richard Peirce, wildlife conservationist, author, and film producer. This time to chat about pangolins. Richard explains how in February 2020, while the novel coronavirus was fast spreading across the world, pangolins were thrust into the global spotlight when scientists discovered that the virus may have come to humans via bats and pangolins. Welcome back, Mr. Richard Peirce.
Well, it's good to be here. Thanks for asking me back.
Awesome. Richard, your book, Scales of Injustice, published in 2020, is about pangolins. Why did you find it necessary to write a book about pangolins?
Well, these poor guys have got the most unfortunate label. The label is they're the most trafficked wild mammal in the world. And so, when someone like me hears a label like that, then it just intrigues you. And you look at it, and I looked at it and got intrigued by it. And then what I heard from almost everyone I spoke to, they talked about the eye of the pangolin. And my wife and I got really intrigued about this magical, mystical eye. And when we met our first pangolin, which was actually up in Johannesburg at the Veterinary Wildlife Hospital, I felt quite sorry for the animal, really, because it was taken out of its box, ready to be weighed and taken out for its nightly feeding walk. And it had these two humans kind of positioning themselves in front of it to peer into its eye, just so we could experience the magical, mystical. But hey, it's very weird. There is something about the eye of a pangolin, and it is kind of bewitching. And you look at it, and it looks at you, it looks into you, it looks around you, and it kind of looks at you in a wise, almost forgiving way, which is extraordinary when you consider that there may be 1.5 million pangolins being trafficked out of Africa every year. When you hear that this is the most trafficked animal in the world, then you've got to jump in and kind of have a go.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you made mention of the wisdom that you feel looking into the eye of a pangolin, because it is, in fact, a totem in Africa as being a wise old man of the world and the bearer of good news and good fortune and rain, which is awesome. So thanks for touching on that.
Do you mind if I just touch on what you've just said?
Go for it.
One of the most fascinating interviews I did for this book was with a bushman up in the Kalahari. And indeed, rain was something that they are rain bringers. And the Bushmen do the pangolin song. And they do the pangolin song when the moon is lying on its side. So it's like a slither of moon. And they burn pangolin scales, not from one they've killed, but, from one they found or whatever. And the sparks go up to the heavens, and they sing the pangolin song. And then the next day, the moon, which on its side has served like a bucket of water. So there's water in it, okay? The next day, the moon will have moved a bit. Of course it will. And then the rain comes and the water comes down. And the most weird thing was, when he told us that story in the Kalahari, then we were driving back to Uppington, I think, the next day or something. And guess what? It rained all the way. So coincident maybe, but I choose to believe. And the other thing is that they are wise and they are calming. The Bushmen use them as medicine for calming sort of diarrhea, for calming people with stress and with seizures. So I always think calmness implies a kind of wisdom anyway. So the totem things you've just mentioned are very much in Bushman culture.
That's incredible, and thank you for sharing that little tidbit. You've mentioned a few times now that they are the most trafficked mammal on the planet. Can you touch on why this is, Richard?
Well, there are 4 Asian species. The Asian species have been depleted to such an extent that there aren't enough wild pangolins, from point of view of people trying to harvest them to keep up with the demand. So they've switched their attention, a lot of the traffickers, to Africa. And now they're coming here and they're depleting Africa of its pangolins. I mean, to find a pangolin in Southeast Asia now, any one of those 4 species, I gather is quite a challenge. And when I was in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos and places, I'm no expert on identifying from scales, but it did look to me, I had pictures, it did look to me as if the scales I was seeing in the market were actually from Africa, mainly from Temminck's pangolins. So yeah, I mean, look, the last figure I have, and a lot of this stuff is pre-COVID, obviously. The last figure I have is from 2019, when 97 tons of loose scales left Africa. That is apparently about 160,000 pangolins. Now, they reckon that they only catch about 10%. So, even my schoolboy pathetic maths can suss out that's over 1.5 million pangolins being trafficked out of Africa a year to meet the demand. So why? They're a delicacy. These scales are ground down and they're used. Believe it or not, this is a bit disgusting. Baby sort of pangolin fetuses are stuck in bottles and they make pangolin wine. I mean, there are all these kind of like pangolin products. And all the scale is keratin, just like rhino horn, just like our fingernail. So it's the same nonsense, this sort of wanted delicacy, which actually does nothing whatsoever. Maybe gives you a stomachache, I suppose. Certainly no aphrodisiac qualities. And the way they do it, I'm sure that they don't experience the sort of effects the Bushmen do, for example. I mean, I'm sure part of the Bushmen's experiencing of effects probably is they want to believe. I'm a great believer in that. But so the demand is huge. And it's for medicinal purposes. It's for status purposes. Not really ornamental like rhino horn has become, but all that stuff. When I was in Saigon, I got a tip off about a restaurant. And I went along to this restaurant, which was supposed to serve interesting wild animals like pangolin. I went along there and there were no codes. There was no secret touching of the nose or signs or anything. I was just a guy walking in off the street, a tourist. So I said, have you got anything interesting, any wild meat? And the first thing he offered me within a minute, was civets. Now, civets were the likely vector for the 2002 SARS epidemic. And that was the first sort of recent deadly coronavirus we've had. So I said, no, that's not that interesting, really. I've had civet before. I mean, have you got anything have you got pangolin? But no hesitation, yes. And I hummed and hawed. And so I think that was interpreted as me bargaining. So the sum of money came right down immediately. And eventually I was being offered pangolin, the whole animal, and every place I went to looking for products, I was finding pangolin scales. Now these are supposed to be illegal, and if me, a tourist, can find them, then the local police can surely find them. So it really is pretty bonkers stuff, and it's pretty mind blowing when you see the whole scale of this. It's like a giant sort of animal parts supermarket. These countries, and they're all members of CITES, and they've all signed up not to trade in these animals in the way they are. So they're all breaking the law. Well, in fact, perhaps breaking the law is the wrong way. They're just not bothering to enforce the law, which I guess is something slightly different. But yeah, absolutely appalling. And I came away from there very, very depressed, because not just pangolin, but rhino horn, ivory, pangolins, tiger products, the whole lot are there, available to you or to me.
You mentioned CITES. As part of my research in preparing for having a chat with you, I've discovered that all 8 species of pangolin were moved from CITES Appendix 2 to CITES Appendix 1 in January 2017. So given the volume of busts that have been made between 2015 and 16 and 17, there's been a very definite uptick from 2018 onwards in terms of the trafficking of this animal, and not only the scales, but the whole animal as well. One of the busts that was conducted by the Environmental Investigation Agency records whole pangolin bodies frozen in a box, a whole lot of them, or individually, and that's 10 to 1 the offer that was made to you at this dodgy restaurant.
Mine was even worse than that, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So initially, I was being offered pangolin at $300 a kilogram. So I hummed and hawed, and I said I couldn't quite relate that to the whole animal, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So then he offered me a whole animal for $4,000. So I still sort of fiddled about, and he clearly thought I was negotiating. So that came down to $3,000 for the whole pangolin. And then he tried to sell it to me by taking me upstairs and showing me a private dining room off the main restaurant, set up for, I think it was 10 people. And here's the nasty bit. The very clear hint was that if I was worried that I was going to get what I was paying for, they would bring the animal to the private dining room and kill it for me. Right by the table. So that's an actual experience. Just a tourist straight off the street, as blatant as that.
It's very, very disappointing. Very disappointing.
It's horrifying. Yeah.
Just before the CITES comment, you also mentioned being offered civet, who had been suspected as being responsible for the outbreak of SARS.
Yeah.
In your book specifically, you state that scientists have identified pangolin as a likely source of the coronavirus infection that brought the world to its knees. Can you share a little bit more on this, please?
Yeah, it was exciting in a sense, because I was actually up in a place called Swalu, up in the southern Kalahari, which is probably the best place in the world to see pangolins. But we'll come back to that. And I was working with a wonderful girl called Wendy Penena, who's probably the lead researcher on pangolins. And there was another author there doing stuff. And I was having a cup of coffee with Wendy one afternoon. This guy came galloping across with his laptop in his hand and said, "Oh, look." And it was the 8th of February 2020 when there had been a match discovered between coronavirus material, the COVID-19, and the Malayan pangolin. And then the scientists went on and looked at it more and more closely, and science still can't quite agree. And they still can't quite agree about civets with regard to 2002 either. But I think lots of scientists still believe there is a very high likelihood that it was a Malayan pangolin consumed in Wuhan that may have been the vector for this outbreak. I mean, look, there are other theories, and some of them are bonkers. Given the amount of research they were doing on bats, which were being brought back to the laboratory in Wuhan, given the reservoir that bats are for coronaviruses, it's not impossible it wasn't sloppy lab procedure that got this thing out. But I've been to wet markets in China, as well as Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam, etc. And, what you've got is you've got wire cages stacked on top of each other. And so you might have bats on top. And you might have pangolins underneath, and you might have civets underneath that. And then, the bats are pooing and peeing and stuff, and that material's coming down through, and maybe a pangolin's taking it in somehow. Or maybe if something's killed, the hygiene when they're butchering meat ain't great. And I mean, those slabs of wood that they chop them up on half the time, they're not being properly cleaned from one chopping up to another. And so there are many ways that the infection can get across. So I think the jury is out, but I think there's quite a strong case that pangolins were the vector. I mean, that's an incredible thing. That must be the most expensive meal ever eaten on the planet. What an incredible meal that would have been. I mean, I don't know how many $1 trillion it's now estimated that the pandemic cost, but frightening stuff.
It is frightening stuff. Do you think that once this news came out that the Chinese authorities responded appropriately? I remember reading that they did in fact close the wet markets down for actually quite a length of time. And I think I've read recently that they have since reopened.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a bit out of date now, but they did in June 2020, they did remove pangolin scales from the traditional, the TCM list, traditional Chinese medicine list. It's now crept back on. But the problem with all these things is one of enforcement. And we all got very excited early in 2020 when the Chinese government made various moves towards curtailing the trade in wildlife. And they were supposed through the whole of 2020 to be conducting a sort of consultative process. So in the autumn of that year, when they had one of their big powwows in the People's National Congress, I think it's called, then they were going to redraw all their laws. And we were all massively excited by this, but it was a bit of a damp squib, really. Nothing much happened, and what little did happen, I suspect, is not being enforced anyway. In contrast with Vietnam, Vietnam actually do seem to be making a far greater effort. In July 2020, they announced it was banning wildlife imports. It was closing down wildlife markets. Now, I know that it hasn't happened, but I believe they're trying, and it is happening, and more policing is going on. A friend of mine works there undercover. He was telling me the other day that, he is seeing effort. So that's a positive move.
It certainly is. And it's not only a positive move for pangolin, but for a whole host of other wildlife that we know finds its way via and ultimately to the market of Vietnam. So that's very encouraging.
Yeah, no, it is absolutely very encouraging.
Richard, could you share a few details of the horrors and dangers of the trade in this enigmatic and actually little known animal?
Yeah, I mean, I always say I'm not really an expert on anything because I'm only as good as the last book I wrote or the last film I wrote. But when I met a guy called Ray Janssen, Professor Ray Janssen in Joburg, it was a gift to a storyteller. Because here's this kind of gangling, absent-minded professor type of character who spends half his time when he's not at university teaching people, sitting around in cars on stakeouts with a pistol next door to him, waiting to catch guys trafficking pangolins. So, for me, this was just great. I mean, I had a great character, and he was a bit of a contradiction, etc. And he interviewed very well. And he talks very, very sort of, convincingly and compellingly about the horrors. I mean, these guys are not difficult at all to get hold of. They roll into a ball. So they're turning themselves into a present for you. You just pick them up. The scales are a bit sharp, so maybe cut yourself, but easy to pick up. And then they're chucked in sacks or in all sorts of things and trafficked, often down from Zimbabwe. Well, that's kind of a channel down there. And then they end up being sold in South Africa unless someone like Ray intercepts them on the way. And then an awful lot of them end up in the Johannesburg Veterinary Wildlife Hospital. And then two wonderful women there put them back together. Nikki and Karen are extraordinary. Nikki is a sort of animal rehabilitator, if that's a word in English, I don't know. And Karen's a vet. And so they get the survivors from the process that Ray rescues, and they put them back together sort of mentally and physically. And some of these animals are massively traumatized, massively stressed, lost a lot of weight. And it ain't easy feeding up a pangolin when all he eats is ants and termites. When you buy those, you don't sort of nip off to Pick and Pay and say, 6 kilos of ants, please. So they put them back together, and Jacqui and I were lucky enough to go on a walk. So it's all pretty secret where they take them because, obviously they don't want to be intercepted. But we went out with 2 or 3 animals one night, and they take them out. They put little lights on them so that when it gets dark in the bush, you can see this little flashing in front of you in the bush. And we followed them in the bush while they gobbled up loads of ants and termites and things. And obviously the pangolins would have stayed out there all night. But once they're thought to have had a bellyful, which might be 2 or 3, 4 hours, then they're brought back again. And then very often they get released in Natal, in a place called Pinda. So those are the lucky ones, and people like Ray and those other 2 and all the wonderful people who work with them. There's an extraordinary woman up in Zimbabwe called Lisa Highwood. She's sort of the main rescuer and rescue center up there. So I wish these people didn't have to exist. But given the plight that pangolins have got, I'm really grateful that they do exist. And it is a horror story. I mean, here's an animal, I know people who dislike sharks. I mean, I did sharks for 20, 30 years. And so, because people are frightened of them. But how can you dislike this wonderful, harmless, fabulous, mystical little creature? What have they ever done to man? Nothing. I mean, they've never done anything to anybody, unless you're an ant or a termite. Then you might be a little bit fed up with them. But Yeah, the whole trade is a horror story. Then very often from Central Africa, they end up in Nigeria, dead, alive, or in terms of, sacks of scales. And then that's where an awful lot of the intercepts happen. Nigeria, or from Nigeria to Singapore. And then Singapore is another major sort of, center out of Africa. And from Singapore, then they head for the markets like Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Thailand, and of course, mainly China. So that's kind of the route. One of the things I'm hoping to do, following a film I made called Lions, Bones and Bullets, is to do a pangolin on it. And I want to actually track them from being smuggled out of Africa to the consumer end. And I'm not going to say how I intend to do it because no one will ever talk to me if they know what I'm going to. That is going to be my next film project, I hope, to do that sort of investigation, but for pangolins.
Well, I'm very excited about that because having seen your Lions, Bones and Bullets movie and the level of investigation that was clearly done for that in order to have people understand what is happening with African lions was incredible. So sign me up for the pangolin film. You mentioned the routes that are being used by the traffickers. Again, in just getting some up-to-date information for our chat, I've found, again, the Environmental Investigation Agency announced in January 2021 that wildlife contraband in Nigeria seized 8.8 tons of tusks, pangolin scales, and bones that was all due to be shipped to Vietnam. So, yes, that speaks to the point you made about the route they follow.
This is highly organized trafficking. It's just like the drugs trade, the illegal trade, the illegal arms trade, the human trafficking trade. These are highly organized gangs. And I remember talking to some guy once years ago in Interpol, and he was one of the wildlife guys. He said, we're at a major disadvantage because we've got to obey the rules. And we've got the problem of borders. We can't just go into country X, Y, or Z without contacting that police force and asking them, may we, and how may we, and will you join, et cetera, et cetera. But the crooks don't have any such constraints. So theirs is business without borders, which really does put law enforcement at a significant disadvantage.
Yes, and I think what it would hopefully do is encourage different countries' law enforcement to actually work together, as opposed to, just once the traffickers have crossed the border say, oh, well, it's not our problem anymore. We really need to consolidate our efforts in protecting animals like the pangolin. Just to comment to your reference to sharks, I mean, there's a lot of animals out there that are problem animals as far as humans are concerned, rats and flies and mosquitoes. But pangolin are certainly very far from that. In fact, they make lives easier for us, eating on the largest availability of protein in the world, termites and ants. So,
absolutely,
it's very short-sighted of us to be treating them this way.
Well, I think it was interesting you said, problem animals for humans. I think the most problem animal on the planet, you know exactly what I'm going to say, is humans. Remove us and all the other guys are going to be much, much happier.
Agreed. I'm with you on that one. You were going to come back to your point about one of the best places to see pangolins in the world, and I'm not sure if that also includes your experience with African Pangolin Working Group.
Well, the African Pangolin Working Group is a pretty, it's several people. They directed me towards Swalu. Swalu is an extraordinary story. I mean, Swalu was a whole bunch of, it was a sort of barren area that had been over-farmed, sort of, savanna. And this, I think it was an English guy, actually, who bought up all these farms and joined them together and decided to return it to pristine bush. So all the fences came down, et cetera, et cetera. Stephen Bowler. He was actually going to make it a hunting farm, which perhaps is not that great, but nevertheless. And he died, having finished the project. But before he died, he had got the Oppenheimers enthused. And so when he died, I think the Oppenheimers got a bit of a shock because in his will, I think he had said that the Oppenheimers were to be given first refusal, taking Swalu over and running it. So I suspect they may well have felt a sort of certain onus of responsibility. But anyway, they did. And it's now this magical, wonderful reserve. I think it's the largest private reserve in South Africa anyway. Wendy, because of the research she's doing with satellite tagged animals, telemetry tagged animals, etc., she has a very good idea. And so when the scouts, when the guides can't find animals for their clients, actually you can cheat. You can go to Wendy because she jolly well knows where they are. And she tells wonderful stories of people who come from all over the world to see pangolins. And they're not greedy. All they want is a look at them. There was one poor guy, she thought that it was probably sort of one of his bucket list things. And he couldn't even walk, so he couldn't get that close. It had to be through a pair of binoculars. But she said the look on his face and the look of peace when it had a look at this animal that he had traveled from the United States, I think it was, to see. The only drawback, of course, with swallow is it is, I'm afraid, quite an expensive option. So you do need quite deep pockets to go there. But it is the best place in the world to see them. I mean, I've looked and looked and looked, and I've God knows how many years I've been going up the Kalahari now, but I've never seen one in the wild. I wandered around with Wendy and I saw lots of holes, and I knew that there were pangolins down the holes. But I was so grateful for seeing them at the hospital in Joburg. I mean, they are really magical, extraordinary animals.
I have yet to see one myself. I mean, I don't get to spend as much time in the bush as maybe what I'd like to, or what you have the opportunity to do. But one day, yes, one at Swallow or one in a hospital, I don't mind. I'll take what I can get.
I mean, one of the great sadnesses, which, I really do find choking, actually, is, Game Fence has a sort of a strand about, not more than about, I was going to say a foot in English money, a short way above the ground, okay? And what they do is they'll be going along a game fence and they will suddenly get an electric shock and they'll curl up round the wire. And so they basically electrocute themselves. And I've several times heard from people who inspect those fences and the rangers that the only pangolins they've ever seen were ones who had sadly died in that rather horrendous manner. Yeah.
It's very sad to hear. A question to you, Richard, in terms of your opinion on something. Obviously, these pangolins are being tracked by the poachers, right? And then captured, and then they start their journey through the trafficking chain. My mind wants to inquire, where are these trackers / poachers coming from? Is it local communities? Is it people that are coming through from our neighboring countries, knowing that the borders are porous and that they can track these animals and steal them and ferry them away from us? What do you think? Where are these poachers coming from?
The animal, if we talk about South Africa, the animal that I tell the story of at the beginning of my books, an animal called Zambezi. And he's called Zambezi because he came from southern Zimbabwe. And he would have been trafficked down. I think what almost certainly happens, and this was according to Ray Janssen, is you'll get these sort of, the next stage in the trafficking operation, you'll get these opportunists who will go out to rural communities and they'll tell these guys what they'll pay for what. And, if you are a poor guy in Zimbabwe with a family and living at subsistence level, in a sort of rural situation, and someone comes along and offers you, I don't know, a couple of $1,000 or whatever, that will feed you for a long time, then it'll turn a lot of people into crooks who are otherwise honest. And that is, I think, the sort of gatherer end of the thing, And I always think that if we could lift these people out of poverty, in a way, we would cut off an awful lot of the capture net part of it. Because it's the big fat guys who rely on the hungry guys further down the chains, really do their dirty work for them. And that's all over Africa. That's not just in South Africa, whether it's, Central Africa or wherever. It's the guys who know the bush, who know where to find the animals. And then they're not doing it because they hate the animals. They're doing it because they want to make a bit of money. So give them a job in a hotel instead. Much better.
Or give them a job tracking to find the animals so that people like the gentleman in the wheelchair at Swallow can see them, without them being tracked by telemetry.
No, absolutely. Sure, absolutely. One year I noticed that Mozambique, I think, was getting given a very considerable sum of money by Britain in aid. And that was a time when an awful lot of the rhino poachers were coming out of Mozambique. And so I went to see the development deputy minister for overseas aid or development. And I said, why don't you put some money caveats with this? And instead of just giving money, why don't you say you want it to be spent on tourist development in that area, for example? Because none of these guys want to go and poach rhinos. They're doing it for money. And they don't want to get shot at by rangers. So if you give them a safe job in tourism that doesn't involve them risking their lives, they would far prefer that. In southern Mozambique, for example, these guys don't want to cross the river and go poaching rhino and get shot at by an AK-47 in the hands of a ranger. They don't want to risk their lives at all. So if they were offered a job in tourism somehow, then I'm sure they would far prefer that, and their family would prefer it because they wouldn't be risking their lives or risking jail.
Well, Richard, this has been once again a fascinating conversation about conservation, the plight of the pangolins. It's World Pangolin Day, so I think our timing in this regard has been impeccable. And once again, thank you very much for taking the time to have a chat with us.
And if anybody's listening with a big bank account, please give me a shout because I need money for my film.
I love it. Thank you, Richard. If you would like to learn more about Richard Peirce, his books and film, please see the link in the description. Thanks for taking the time to listen. We hope you'll join us in our next conservation conversation. And just a quick shout out to the Original Music Shop, also known as Tom's, for assisting us with our podcasting equipment.